Hello, and welcome to the Full Circle Podcast, your source for insights into the science and art of endurance sports training and racing. I'm your host, Coach Laura Henry. Today is Coach Tip Tuesday. Each and every endurance athlete will hear the advice, nothing new on race day, at some point in their endurance sports journey. Typically, this is advice that is given early on, so athletes are often familiar with it right from the beginning of when they start training and racing. It's very common advice doled out to athletes that cautions them against wearing anything new on race day, such as shoes or clothing. Basically, the premise is that athletes should test out gear in training before they use it in a race. But is this what nothing new on race day actually means? Most athletes would probably answer, yes, of course that's what it means. However, I've learned that nothing new on race day is advice that applies to far more than just tangible and physical things such as shoes or clothing. I contend that athletes truly shouldn't do anything new on race day. And yes, I mean anything. While what athletes wear does fall under this umbrella, I also think that other things, to include behaviors, habits, and strategies, should not be done for the first time on race day. Here are some of the most common and important things that I think should be practiced in training, though, as always, this is not a comprehensive or all-inclusive list of everything that shouldn't be new on race day. Gear, fueling, hydration, the time of day that the workout or the race is completed, race day execution strategies, pre- and post-race nutrition, which is different than fueling that is done in a workout or a race. Talking about what to do or what not to do on race day may seem like an odd topic to discuss right now, which is at the end of the main racing season here in the Northern Hemisphere. But it's actually precisely the correct time to talk about this, because the only way to not do something new on race day is to ensure that the things that an athlete wants to do on race day are done in training. In other words, this is something that needs to be thought about ahead of time, ahead of race day, and ideally ahead of the period of time when an athlete is building toward a particular goal race, aka before they plan or write their training for that race. By considering this at this stage of training, athletes and coaches can construct a plan that enables athletes to thoroughly try, test, and refine the things that they want to implement on race day. How do you know if you did something new on race day? It's actually quite simple. If you do something, for the first time on race day, and or you do something different on race day than you'd practiced or you did in training, then that means you did something new on race day. Very interestingly, I have watched countless athletes over the years do something new on race day and be unhappy with their race outcome or performance. I do not think that this is a coincidence. And for what it's worth, based on my experience living over the years, I don't think there is such a thing as a coincidence, especially when it comes to outcomes in endurance sports, but that's a different podcast episode for a different day. In many cases, I think unhappy outcomes are linked to when athletes did something different or new on race day. In other words, doing something new on race day can, and often does, cause unintended and undesired results. Many athletes actually do something new on race day. Even more interesting than observing them doing something new on race day, I have watched many of those same athletes lack the self-awareness to identify that they did, in fact, do something new on race day. Part of my work with the athletes I coach involves going through a post-race analysis with them. And no matter the outcome, positive or negative, we always talk through what the athlete did during the race in terms of fueling, hydration, gear, execution strategy, and more. They'll tell me what they did, and they often won't outwardly state that they did something new. But that being said, because I've reviewed their post-workout notes and final surge, and I have been alongside them during their training, I can tell pretty much immediately if something on race day is different from what a given athlete has done in training. When this has happened, I've pointed out to many athletes that they did something new on race day. And when I've done so, I've had several, as in more than one, respond with statements such as, well, it's not really new. Or, no, I didn't really do anything new on race day. Or, it's only sort of new. Here's the hard truth, folks. If you do something on race day that you did not do in training, then you did something new on race day. I understand why athletes, and especially seasoned and experienced athletes who have heard this advice many times over, would be reluctant to admit that they did, in fact, do something new on race day. It is a so-called quote unquote rookie mistake to make. And so it might feel embarrassing to say it out loud. And upon reflection, once they know the outcome of their race, it can seem quite obvious that doing something new or different might not have been a good idea. It is very, very hard to admit when we make mistakes, and this only gets more true as we get older and more experienced. But just because something is hard to admit or you don't want something to be true doesn't mean that it isn't true. It's important to recognize when we engage in certain behaviors, yes, especially the unattractive ones, to be honest with ourselves and to say out loud what is true. This helps us move forward in a positive direction and to develop both solid training plans and race strategies moving forward to help set ourselves up for success. So if you do something new on race day, it's important to be honest about it and to say it out loud. The number one new thing I see athletes do on race day is a new race execution strategy. A race execution strategy is the process by which an athlete actually goes about completing a race. Elements such as pacing, power, effort, fueling, hydration, and method are all part of a race execution strategy. When athletes execute a new strategy on race day, the shape of the newness, can and will differ from athlete to athlete and from sport to sport, but the premise is the same. An athlete has a vision of how they will execute the race, and they attempt to do that on race day without ever having meaningfully practiced that vision in training. The most common example, by far, that I see of this in my work is with runners and triathletes who leverage a run-walk strategy in training and who do not want to run-walk on race day. Instead, they have a vision of themselves running, just running, the entire running race or the entire run leg of a multi-sport event. Many athletes have a misconception that they are not real runners unless they run without breaks. This is false. False. If you don't believe that it's false, consider what you would say to somebody else who is deploying a run-walk strategy. Would you tell them that they're not a real runner? Would you? If you wouldn't say it to them, then it's not true for you either, and you shouldn't say it to yourself. So even though a given athlete has literally never, ever completed a race-specific training run, such as a long run, without walking intervals, they attempt to run the entire race without using the strategy that they honed and many times perfected in training. A side note, in many cases, they attempt to do this without telling me ahead of time that they will be doing it. I learn about it after they run the race. And let me be perfectly clear. While taper phase does do wonderful things in terms of race preparedness for athletes, it does not magically make athletes able to do things that they have not recently been able to do in training. The best predictor of future performance is your current performance, and this includes your current strategy that you are leveraging in training. If you haven't practiced a running-only strategy in the training build-up to a particular race, you will not be able to magically run an entire event well, and you will not be able to maximize your current training potential on race day. Some athletes may get away with it, but they should be aware that that's what is happening. They are getting away with it. They are not implementing the strategy that they prepared. They are not implementing the best strategy, the highest probability of getting that successful outcome. Implementing and executing the strategy that is practiced and honed in training gives athletes the highest probability of reaching their current potential and of having a positive outcome and result in a racing situation. Beyond athletes who try to run an entire race when they haven't trained to do so, the second most common new thing I observe athletes attempting to do on race day is related to food and hydration intake. Athletes will change their pre-race nutrition and also change their mid-race fueling and hydration strategy. Whether they are increasing or decreasing quantities, changing the rate at which they are consuming things, altering the timing of what they are consuming, changing what they are actually consuming, and more, this is a very common thing for athletes to do differently or new on race day. The gastrointestinal system, the GI system, is like other systems in the body, like the cardiorespiratory system. It can be trained with time, but it does need time to respond to and adapt to a stimulus that is imposed on it. And so, the daily and pre-workout nutrition and mid-workout fueling and hydration strategies that are implemented in training should be what athletes implement on race day, as those strategies and behaviors are the ones that the body has adapted to and will function best with. There are many, many more examples of things that athletes do that are new on race day. These two are simply the most common ones I've seen over the years in my work as a coach. No matter what the new thing is, the premise behind why not to do it is the same. What works well for you in training is what has the highest probability of working best for you on race day. And thus, that is what you should implement on race day. It's what will give you the best probability of getting the outcome that you're seeking, the outcome that you are trained to do, of reaching that potential that you've earned through your training. There is an effective remedy that can keep athletes from doing something new on race day. Athletes need to be honest, both with themselves, which is the most important, and their coach if they have one, and they need to not have any secret goals. A secret goal is a goal or a vision that you do not share with anyone and that you keep to yourself. Secret goals can and do include strategies and behaviors. Secret goals do not only pertain to timed results. There are many, many reasons why athletes need to be this honest and why they need to communicate all of their goals ahead of time. First and foremost, managing expectations is one of the most important components of training plan design. For athletes who work with a coach needs to understand what an athlete wants and what they expect. At the same time, an athlete, whether they are self-coached or working with a coach, needs to confront the reality of what they can reasonably expect to achieve come race day. Sometimes our expectations are not in alignment with our current capabilities. This is hard, but it is better to have conversations about this before a race or before attempting to achieve a goal. One way or the other, an athlete will learn if their expectations were not in alignment with their current abilities. And believe me, it is far better for athletes to learn and accept what their current abilities are and to manage their expectations appropriately before a race rather than after one where they have effectively crashed and burned. Confronting and addressing this ahead of time also allows an athlete to recast and or reframe goals so that they have the best chance possible at having a positive experience and a successful outcome at a given race. Second, it is nearly impossible to hit a target that we do not know exists. This is true for both self-coached and coached athletes, but it's honestly a bit more important when there's another person involved, aka when an athlete is working with a coach. When athletes work with a coach, the coach designs their training based on what the athlete communicates to the coach, including their goals and what is important to them. Simply put, if a coach doesn't know that an athlete expects or wants something, then the entire training plan will not be oriented in that direction. In fact, while the training plan will be oriented toward what an athlete has communicated to a coach, if the athlete has harbored a secret goal and or they have not been completely honest about what they want, the plan may be oriented in a completely different direction from what the athlete actually wants. And in my experience coaching, this happens at least once a year with athletes that I work with. This past year, it happened 3 times that I learned about a secret goal that an athlete had 10 days before their goal race, which means that the training that I had written was oriented around what the athlete had previously shared with me and wasn't actually in alignment with what the athlete actually wanted. And when I find out this as a coach, and when the athlete fully embraces that their training hasn't been oriented toward that, it's a really disappointing situation. It's heartbreaking in some cases. So this is so important, whether you work with a coach or not, that you communicate what you actually want and you orient your training around what you actually want to achieve. And being honest like this at the onset of training allows athletes to aim for the target that they actually want to hit and to practice the strategies, behaviors, and other elements that they want to implement on race day. Learning whether or not it's actually possible for them prior to race day will help them have the highest probability of successfully realizing their vision for themselves come race day. And that's what we want. We want athletes to be successful. We want them to have that highest probability of success. Nothing new on race day applies to so much more than just gear. While it does apply to gear, it is actually far more important that athletes do not engage in new behaviors, strategies, or techniques come race day. Rather, they should aim to practice those elements in training so they can test out what works, what doesn't work, and what is optimal for them. Then, come race day, athletes can be confident in what they're doing during the race itself and give themselves the best chance of achieving their goals. That was another episode of the Full Circle Podcast. Subscribe to the Full Circle Podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you like what you listen to, please be sure to leave us a rating and review, as this goes a long way in helping us reach others. The thoughts and opinions expressed on the Full Circle Podcast are those of the individual. As always, we love to hear from you and we value your feedback. Please send us an email at podcast@fullcircleendurance.com or visit us at fullcircleendurance.com/podcast. To find training plans, see what other coaching services we offer, or to join our community, please visit FullCircleEndurance.com. I'm Coach Laura Henry. Thanks for listening.